Well, it's a pleasure to be here, and we're each allotted 10 minutes, so I will try to limit my rambling. I just want to make a correction to something Fred said. The title of my book with Ken Rogoff is not This Time is Different, Ho Ho, 8 Centuries of Financial Folly. It is just This Time is Different, 8 Centuries of Financial Folly. The ho ho part was he was trying to emphasize that the title is meant to be ironic. All right, having done that little correction, what I'd like to do is basically, I'm going to talk a little bit about the chapter. I was very excited when we were approached to contribute to this book with those 3 questions. And most of what I'm going to talk about is the setup, essentially how we got here, and how we get here again and again and again when you look at the long history of financial crises. I'm going to say a little bit about the aftermath of financial crises, because I think that will lead into Robin Wells' presentation beautifully. So the main thrust of the point that Ken Rogoff and I tried to get across in this chapter is very much the essence of our book, that we now have a crisis in advanced economies that if 6 years ago, the crisis begins with the subprime problems erupting in the summer of 2007. But if I came to any of you in the year 2006 and told you the United States and most of the advanced economies are going to be mired in a deep financial crisis a la 1930s, made different by different policy responses, but the magnitude of the sheer breakdown in the financial system was a comparable order of magnitude. And this engulfed most of the advanced world and paralyzed advanced and emerging market economies in the fall of 2008, early 2009. If I came and told you that we're going to have defaults, but it's not going to be in Latin America, it's not going to be in Africa, it's not going to be in emerging Asia, it's going to be in Europe, and that the whole Euro experiment is called into question as a consequence, would you have believed me? The answer is probably not. You probably think I was out to lunch. You probably still do think I was out to lunch, but that's a separate issue. What I would like to convey is that the crises that we have undergone in the United States and in the advanced economies, which is still unfolding, is not a post-World War II financial crisis. It's not a post-World War II event. You really have to go to the pre-war period to see something comparable. And what are the antecedents of these crises? How does such a crisis build up? Well, crises share in common the "this time is different" syndrome. Namely, when things are going well, the economy is growing, asset prices are booming, we feel we are all geniuses, and we can therefore borrow accordingly. So during the boom periods, a common thread throughout most financial crises, the private sector leverage begins to build, and we accumulate a lot of debt. And I can say that given the time series that we have, which spans centuries, one element that where this time is different is the sheer order of magnitude of the private debts that we have accumulated in the run-up to this crisis. Especially household debt is in uncharted waters, not just in the US, but also in Europe, and bank debts as well. So the antecedent is characterized by booms in asset prices, debt buildups, but this process is amplified. So they're what we call, and it's fed by relatively easy credit, and it's fed also by, importantly, borrowing from abroad. Most of the countries in the advanced economies that had massive financial crises, from the extreme case of Greece to Spain, to Ireland, to the US, to the UK, had large current account deficits. A different way of putting that is they had large capital inflows. They were borrowing from the rest of the world. So lots of borrowing, domestic and external, is part of this story. It's facilitated by poor regulation. It's facilitated by a very laissez-faire approach to the financial industry, which sort of brings me a little closer to where we are now. So what happens next? Private leverage has been built up. Typically, something begins to slow the economy down. Asset prices start to collapse. And once asset prices start to collapse, the debts that look good in the boom time no longer look well. And that's the pattern that, and at that conjuncture, when a financial crisis erupts, fiscal finances get destroyed. You have associated with very severe, one of the big points that Ken Rogoff and I have made for several years now is that recessions following severe financial crises are deeper and more protracted. We cannot look to your standard post-World War II recession to make a comparison. And that's where we still are. We have seen signs of recovery in the US. The signs of recovery in Europe are at best tenuous and very uneven. But the cycle, the longer cycle, which is what I will conclude on, and where that takes us is after these excesses are built up, it takes a long time to unwind. So, you know, at the risk of being a wet rag, I will reiterate a recurring theme of my research, which is we are in a protracted period of a very subpar economic performance. The decade, and this is based on work with Vincent Reinhart, my husband, a paper that we did for the Jackson Hole Conference called After the Fall, which looks at a decade following severe financial crises. Decades after severe financial crises are characterized by very slow deleveraging. They're characterized by debt overhangs on the public sector as revenues implode during the crises and the public sector takes on a lot of private debt. Nowhere is this more evident than in the extreme case of Ireland. And that essentially it takes a long time to regain pre-crises levels of employment and pre-crises levels of output in some cases. Let me point out, and I'll stop right here, that in the 15 crises that Vincent and I looked at in the paper After the Fall, after 10 years of a severe crisis, unemployment had not returned to its pre-crisis levels. And this is a continuing policy challenge. The debt buildup is a continuing policy challenge. So, in other words, the advanced economies are mired in a situation in which no one in this room, even the oldest of you, can really remember. We had not had this kind of combination of debt overhang, weak economy, and stubborn unemployment anywhere in the period post-war. So let me stop right there in that uplifting note and turn it over to Janet Wells.
I want to start by thanking Janet for conceiving of this wonderful child and birthing it. And I have to say, Janet, you really did this in the true spirit of Occupy Wall Street because you're an outsider. And Janet was very gracious in assigning me as guest editor. I helped a little bit at the fringes, but really all of it was yours, and you were in the very best spirit of Occupy Wall Street. And you really, you know, you had the energy, you had the insight, you had the drive, you pulled it together. And I also want to thank the Peterson Institute for hosting this. The title of the article, co-authored with my husband, Paul Krugman, is The Widening Gyre, Inequality, Polarization, and the Crisis. And so forgive me for a minute. I think this must be a first. I'm going to actually start talking about economics by citing a little poetry. Okay, because The Widening Gyre comes from a poem written by William Butler Yeats in 1919, and let me just read to you the first 3 or 4 lines. Turning and turning in the widening gyre, the falcon cannot hear the falconer. Things fall apart, the center cannot hold. Mere anarchy is loosed upon the world. Okay? So what I want to talk to you about today is the widening gyre, and the widening gyre is on various dimensions and making it a particularly difficult crisis that we are facing. So let me start by giving you a graphic. Here we go. And if you saw today's New York Times, this actually was taken from a front page article on Thomas Piketty and Edward Saiz, Emmanuel Saiz, who are also in the book, Emmanuel along with Peter Diamond. And as you can see here, this is the share of all U.S. income according to the income class. The top 1% is the red line. The yellow line is the top 4%, and now is the next 5% is the bottom one. And you can see along the bottom, this is going back to 1913. So we are back at a share of all U.S. income going to the top 1% that is right at the Great Gatsby days. And what is also quite remarkable that you can't see from this graph is that not only has the top 1% pulled away, but the top 0.01% has really pulled away. All right, so we are now back at the Great Gatsby phase. I should also say, having some intimate dealings with the New York Times, the paper of record, I think it was also remarkable that they printed this. That shows that this is finally becoming a topic that's in the normal discourse. So we see here we have great income inequality, but that's also mapped into a couple of other dimensions. Along with that, we have increasing political polarization, which I'll talk about in a minute. And on top of that, heavens forbid, we have academic polarization among economists, which, as we say in our article, both the political and the academic polarization make it much more difficult for us to adequately deal with the crisis that we're in. So if I can go on now to our next slide. So here, what we talk about in our article, we're not political scientists, so we're borrowing here from McCarty, Poole, and Rosenthal, who are political scientists who have been mapping a kind of a metric of how you measure positions of members of Congress. And what they found over time is that, it used to be, say, up into, I think, up through about the Reagan period, congressmen could be ranked on various dimensions. How you felt on taxes wasn't necessarily how you felt about education policy, all right? But increasingly, since then, the metric upon which we can look at congressmen has collapsed to one dimension, and that one dimension is basically how redistributionist and how do you feel about tax policy. It's become basically along the lines of income inequality. So what they do here along that metric is that they look at people's various positions in Congress and they map that on a left-right continuum, a liberal-conservative continuum. And you can see here that what's happened is that, of course, the red line being Republicans being above the Democrats because above is conservative and below is liberal, is a pulling away of the Republicans and the Democrats. and that's most distinctive in the House. So that's that big gap that you see over towards the right, 2011, the deep pulling apart. All right. We also see that for the here as well in excuse me, here's where they took it and they actually broke it down over time among Southern Democrats, Democrats, and Northern Democrats, so you can see it within the Democratic Party, and seeing how we have increasing polarization as the Southern Democrats collapse with all the other Democrats, but the Republicans are again pulling away. I'll just go through this quickly. And finally, we have here the same continuum in which they rate various presidents. And what we can see here is that, again, if you go from Ike to George Bush in terms of the Republicans, and increasing pulling away towards a conservative metric for Republicans, and Obama being the most centrist Democrat since Truman, okay? So my argument to you here, let me just turn this back. So you don't. My argument to you here is that these are all related, all right? We can't necessarily say that there is a one-to-one relationship between income inequality and polarization in politics, but there's certainly a strong correlation. And regulation, the deregulation fury that the Republicans brought in that allowed us to deregulate Wall Street, as Carmen talked about, laid the groundwork for the Wall Street implosion that we have now. So what does that mean in the future? What we're finding is that we've fallen into basically a replay of the 30s. We had increasing polarization. We had an asset bubble. We had an asset bubble that decimated the economy, that left households with huge levels of debt. And we know from history, we know from Keynes, we know from Irving Fisher about things like what happens when you have too much debt. We also know from Hyman Minsky that you get these kind of bubbles where people forget. They're in good times, as Carmen talked about. In good times, we think that we're all brilliant. We know for sure that that house price will go up, and that we forget, and then next thing we know, we're plunging down a cliff. How did we happen into this when we've gone through it before? Well, partly it's wishful thinking, but partly it's due to the polarization within the economics profession. What we're finding when it comes to politics is that Keynes basically had the answer. We need to put in Keynesian policies that stimulate the economy, that help people work down debt, that substitute government spending for the consumer spending and the investment spending that cannot be done by the private sector. Now, of course, Obama did effect some stimulus, but it was way too small, and a lot of it was made less effectual by being forced to have tax cuts in. So this is how we see that the political polarization, which is itself partly result of the income inequality, is preventing us from having an adequate response to the mess that we're in. In the article, we talk a little bit about what happens to the economics profession, something that we often think economists are above sort of the ideology. Well, this crisis has shown us that those cracks are very much there. They had been papered over. We mention in the article that Paul Samuelson's textbook, the iconic textbook that many people around the world learn their economics from, was not the first Keynesian textbook, it was actually the second. The first was written a few years earlier by a Canadian, Laurie Tarshis, but it was blackballed. It was blackballed because there were very strong forces who recognized that giving the government a platform, saying that there was good reasons for a government to intervene in the economy, would in their view, be the thin edge of the wedge. So what we've now seen is not a blackballing of economics, but an unlearning, a refusal to understand the basics of economics, sort of the resurgence of the archaic Say's law, which that there can be no insufficient demand. There can be no unemployment that is involuntary. You're unemployed because you must want to be that way. So, I know that like Carmen, I sound very pessimistic here. Well, I think a big part of the battle is recognizing our problems, and again, I want to thank Janet for that. I think also that we are moving on to a new stage. I'm doubtful, just looking at the logistics and seeing what's happening in New York, that we're going to see the kind of protest in New York that we saw in the fall. But that's fine with me, because I think at this point that we need to be more technical. I think that this is going to be a watershed election. I think that more so than we've had for a very long time, the issues are quite clear. We saw it in the budget negotiations in 2011, where Republicans were absolutely adamant against any type of tax increase, and I think we're about to revisit that again this fall. So I guess I would leave you by saying, buckle your seats, your seatbelts.
Thanks very much. I'm going to sound optimistic. I'm rarely accused of being optimistic, actually, so I'm going to kind of revel in it for a few seconds. So I would like to thank Janet for getting me and Daron Ashimoglu, who I co-authored the chapter with, getting us involved in this project, which was very fun. And I'd like to thank Fred Bergston for setting this up. I'd like to particularly thank him for that very generous plug for our new book, Why Nations Fail, in local vendors and readily available on the internet. And why did we get involved in this? We got involved in this because the whole issue of Occupy Wall Street resonated very much with the way we think about sort of comparative economic development and the way we think about what is the essence of sort of prosperity in the United States historically. And we have this very sort of institutionalist view of the world, and when we think about the prosperity historically of the US, we emphasize very much what we call the inclusive nature of economic institutions. What do I mean by inclusive economic institutions? Well, let me just give you one example. If you go back to the 19th century, when the US became the most technologically dynamic society in the world, people who invented things filed patents. And if you go and look at the patent records are very interesting because they contain a lot of information about the background of the patentee. And one of the things which is striking about the background of the patentees is that patentees came from all over the place. They were poor, they were rich, they were elites, they were non-elites, they were artists, they were farmers, they were professional people, they were educated, they were uneducated. So the sort of the genius of the American economic institutions is this ability to harness the talent and skills and passions and ambitions of its people. And that's what makes it so dynamic economically. But to have a set of economic institutions like that, you need a political system that supports it, that guarantees security of property rights, that guarantees equality of opportunity, that invests in the education system. You need a state that provides infrastructure and enforces contracts in an unbiased way. So that system is always subject to challenge. So if you think about the history of the United States, in the book we talk about the history of how the US ended up with these institutions. It goes a long way back. It goes back into the colonial period. It goes back to the foundation of the US society in the 17th century in Virginia, in Maryland, in Pennsylvania, and the kind of conflicts that happened there. And we emphasize very much, and I want to emphasize conflict, because there's always conflict over institutions. So for any society where there's what we call inclusive political institutions underpinning inclusive economic institutions, there's always people who'd like to make the political institutions, less inclusive. They would like to narrow the distribution of power. that would like to capture the political system. And I think, our argument in the chapter is that the main problem for economic inequality is the threat that it will lead to political inequality and an oligarchization of the political institutions. So our emphasis very much is on how the increasing inequality of the type that Robin Wells showed is a threat, whether or not it's a threat to the political system. So one way of thinking about Occupy Wall Street is that it's a sort of reaction from society against this potential oligarchization. And why am I optimistic about the outcome of that? Well, we've been here before. So if you look at the history of the United States institutions, they've been challenged many times before. In the late 19th century, they were challenged by the robber barons in the Gilded Age. And those challenges generated a response by society, the progressive movements, the populists, people kind of fighting back against this oligarchization of the senates and other political institutions. And that led to many types of political reforms. In fact, the falling inequality that Robin Wells's picture showed at the start of the 20th century had a lot to do with those reforms that were implemented as a consequence of this pushback by society. And just like Occupy Wall Street, they were people, farmers, people in the Midwest who kind of mobilized outside the political system. So one interpretation, of Occupy Wall Street is that this is sort of society pushing back against this potential oligarchization of the political system. And I guess we emphasize much more that this is the main threat to US economic institutions and US future prosperity. That's much more of a threat than economic inequality per se, because if the political system becomes oligarchized, then economic institutions become oligarchized, and then that's the thing which really is a concern. Now, whether Occupy Wall Street really is such a movement, it obviously represents a kind of impulse in society, and I guess, it's rather interesting that in such a venue, we're all here talking about this possibility or talking about the consequences of that. That in itself, I guess, is evidence of the success of this, although, I guess one could also dismiss it. So then what we try to do at the end of the chapter is to say, well, what would it take for this to be successful? And I think, we make an analogy to the students' movement in France in 1968. So if you go back to the French students' movement, you see that was a movement that was even more successful, actually far more successful at mobilizing people and attracting everyone's attention. But it was very bad at institutionalizing the gains in some sense. It was very good at focusing people's attention on problems, but it was very bad at institutionalizing that because it was very bad at reaching out to the mainstream politicians and building coalitions with people who were sympathetic to the problems that they were outlining. So I think that, the progressives and populists were successful because they were ultimately very good at getting the mainstream parties to pay attention to what they wanted and moving the politics in the direction of trying to address some of these problems. So whether or not Occupy Wall Street will actually be successful in doing that, I guess, remains to be seen. But that's the sort of interpretation that we put in the chapter, very much focusing on the political side of rising inequality, and that the major concern is that rising inequality leads to an oligarchization of the political system, and that can have very adverse feedback effects on the economy in the way the economy is structured, as anyone who studies Latin America, like myself, knows very well. That's it.
Hi everybody, I'd like to thank Fred and Janet as well for organising this event. As you can tell, I'm British. I just want to assure you that Occupy Wall Street is not some sort of British conspiracy, which you might be suspecting on the basis of the last two speeches. I don't claim to speak for Occupy Wall Street. I'm not involved with it at all. I'm a journalist. Have been a journalist for 25, 30 years. I got sort of interested in it, A, because I live in New York and in Brooklyn, just across the river from where Zuccotti Park was, and B, because I'd spent the last 3-4 years writing about the financial crisis and the issues it raised, and obviously there was some sort of crossover with what the people in Zuccotti Park were saying. So, we're not got very long to talk. I just want to make sort of 3 points really. One, very big picture. one sort of big picture and then back to the big picture again. One disadvantage of going last in a situation like this is that some of the people have obviously made the point you were going to make. We had 3 excellent presentations. So I won't focus on the overall questions of inequality and political corruption, which we've just heard about, but rather the sort of bigger picture. What is it that Occupy Wall Street is tapping into, and why is there such interest in it, even in a place like this, which, as I was thinking when I came down here, is after all an institution named after a leveraged buyout tycoon and a place where the Washington Consensus originated. I think the man who invented the phrase, John, is here in the room, and I used to interview him years ago when I was writing about the IMF and the World Bank. Clearly there's something about, it's not just a bunch of kids out there on the street, there's something about it which resonates with all sorts of people. One of the things, obviously, is that rising inequality, but I think there's a larger issue here. Before I went into journalism, I was sort of a historian of sorts. And when you study history, you realize there's long periods in history when what I'd call sort of closed societies and closed periods of history where the possibilities just aren't that great for change. And every now and again something happens and you have an more open period. And it seems to me that's what happened after the financial crisis 2008. We had this 20 or 30 years of basically a closed history when the sort of Washington Consensus at the international level and then the sort of Reagan-Thatcher, Bush-Blair consensus on sort of domestic level and transatlantically dominated. Deregulation, low taxes, fiscal retrenchment, no mention of redistribution or equality issues, really. Obviously, certain people were talking about it. Paul Krugman, for example, been banging on about it for years, as have I, but nobody really took much notice for a long time. So it seems to me that the Occupy movement, because the financial crisis discredited so much of that, it sort of opened up the sort of possibilities for change. And that's not necessarily positive, because obviously change can go in a bad direction. So we see, what sort of options are on the table. The first reaction was really on the right with the rise of the Tea Party, and the sort of the argument there is really that what was wrong with the free market experiment was that we didn't have enough of it. So what we need is more shock therapy. So that leads to sort of the Paul Ryan budget, the Supreme Court stripping back the healthcare mandate, Mitt Romney proposing more low taxes, and the whole drill movement. It's a coherent view of the world, and it's out there. On the left, Occupy Wall Street, I think, is part of the debate about what really is to sort of replace the sort of Reagan-Thatcher consensus. Obviously, some elements of it obviously are pretty obvious, like re-regulation. We've obviously gone somewhere in that direction already. Higher taxes. Europe and Britain, particularly, they've gone in that route. In the US, it's obviously a big issue whether you can raise taxes. Obama's just proposed a very limited high tax, limited it very much to the sort of top 1%. We'll see how that does in the election, but clearly that will be some part of it. There's also some effort to reassert industrial policy. We see that in the area of clean energy, etc. So that's a sort of, in a macro picture, it seems to me that Occupy Wall Street is sort of part of that debate about how do we shift things back towards the centre or towards the left from the sort of discredited consensus to some extent, anyway. Then stepping down a level, just I just thought I'd say a couple of things about a couple of more specific things that the Occupy movement, I think, raises. One of which, because I've written about it a lot, is sort of close to my heart, and that's sort of market failure in the financial sector, which nobody's really talking about today so far. And we all know that we need a financial sector. Financial intermediation is obviously essential, but I think Occupy Wall Street's tapping into this feeling of how much of it do we need? How much of the financial sector really is about allocating savings to productive investments now, and how much of it is basically rent collection or publicly subsidized speculation. My piece in the book, which originally appeared in the New Yorker a couple of years ago, was based on going around in London, the city, and in Wall Street, basically talking to insiders and some academics about this question. And when you talk to the insiders, and again, this is one reason I think why Occupy is getting a sort of favourable reaction from some places you might not expect, you find that a lot of the knowledgeable insiders agree with the sort of general critique that the financial sector is too big, and that a lot of what's been done is about sort of self-enrichment rather than anything to do with sort of social utility. On a sort of slightly more abstract plane, I mean, I think, part of the whole consensus was built on these two ideas taken from neoclassical economics about efficient markets and Walrasian general equilibrium. And I think, it's pretty clear now that neither of those really apply to the financial markets. Financial markets may be efficient in the very narrow sense that it's difficult to beat them. We see that from fund managers, 80% of them don't beat the markets. But if you're talking about economic efficiency, allocating savings and resources to the most productive places, it's pretty hard to argue that the markets have done a good job of that over the last 15, 20 years when we've had an enormous tech bubble succeeded by an enormous housing bubble. So I think, places for economics and for economic research institutes like this, I would argue you just, rather than sort of subsidizing and producing yet more articles about how efficient the market is the efficient market, can it be saved? I mean, I get 20 of those sent to me every day. It might be a bit more productive to say, okay, the market's inefficient, let's take that as an assumption, and where does it go from here? I'd point to, I mean, there are some people doing that. I interviewed Paul Woolley, former investment banker who set up the Centre for the Study of Dysfunctional Finance at LSE, and has hired some guys over there to start looking in that direction. Over here too, some people at Princeton, there's some interesting papers about what financial institutions really do in the presence of asymmetric information and in the presence we need to be moving in. Because clearly banks and big financial institutions are not the sort of price-taking small firms of classical economic theory. A lot of what they do is to try and create markets in which they have informational advantages and then exploit that informational advantages to try and reap some monopoly rents, at least for a small time, until it gets competed away. Saw that in mortgage-backed securitization. We see it in flash trading, where there's an interesting piece by a guy at the Bank of England, Andrew Haldane, who just presented it in at George Soros's conference last week. 5 out of 6 or 6 out of 7 of the orders in these flash trading platforms are subsequently cancelled before the order goes through. They're just putting them out there to try and extract information, and then they can make money on the tiny micro fractions. Very difficult to argue that that's got any social utility. Obviously, it has some private utility for the guys who do it. So as I say, I think we need a much more skeptical approach to financial markets and to financial institutions. I'm not saying they're all bad by any stretch of the imagination. We need banks, we need banking, but just as economists and as sort of public policy people, we need to be more skeptical. Second one on inequality, which has already been covered, I think just one way to think about it is how much inequality is economically necessary. I remember when I was in college 30 years ago reading a little book by a guy who was across the street, Arthur O'Coon, on the equity efficiency trade-off when he was at Brookings. Clearly there is an equity efficiency trade-off, but if you think of it as a curve, I think it's pretty clear at this stage that we're not on the curve, we're underneath it. We can get more, we can reduce inequality without damaging efficiency. There are Pareto gains there to be had if you want to lapse into economic jargon. I mean, one of the interesting pieces in the book here, I don't know if I'd go as far as them, but is this Saez, Peter Diamond proposal to double the top marginal rate to 70%. I don't know if I'd necessarily go that far. I think it would probably, there'd be a lot of evasion issues you'd have to deal with. But, I think it raises for the first time again, and this is a sort of openness, it raises the question, can you justify high tax rates in a sort of classic economic setting? And until relatively recently, you could. If you take a very utilitarian approach to this, and Arthur Pigou wrote about this 100 years ago. If you assume that there's a diminishing marginal utility of income, which, I think everybody would agree there is, if you're starving, $1's worth more to you than if you're George Soros, then just on strictly utilitarian grounds, you can justify a progressive tax system. You have to do some interpersonal comparisons of utility, but I'm willing to sort of skate over that tricky issue. But again, you can make efficiency old-fashioned economic arguments for equity. And again, I think, that's the fact that these arguments are even being raised again is a sign that how things are changing, which brings me back to ending, which is just, I think this is a very interesting moment, actually, just because we are in a sort of open period where the future isn't really determined. I mean, when I used to come down here in the 90s and write about the Washington Consensus and things like that, it seemed sort of immutable, that sort of settlement. And that was obviously what Blairism and Clintonism were about. It was basically accepting the sort of Thatcher-Reagan settlement and trying to do a bit on the margins by taking some of the products of growth to redistribute right at the bottom. That's what the earned income tax credit is about in the US, which was then copied in the UK. Gordon Brown was a great exemplar of that sort of political philosophy. But if it's based upon a lot of growth which isn't really there, which it seems to have been, we're basically redistributing money from bankers to poor people. If the bankers are creating money which is largely fictitious, then that model doesn't really work. And so what replaces it? So I think, it's fascinating. It's just a fascinating period to be in. And this book is a sort of a small but not wholly insignificant contribution to that debate. And I'm delighted to be in it and delighted to be here. Thanks.